Was Manhattan really sold to the Dutch for just $24? The encounter between European colonists and indigenous Americans is a pivotal chapter in the history of New York, but how much of the commonly told story stands up to scrutiny? History is often painted with broad strokes of grand deals and dramatic exchanges, where enterprising salesmen strike screaming bargains that echo through the ages. One of the most infamous tales centers around Manhattan Island, where legend has it that the island's native inhabitants sold it to the Dutch for nothing more than a handful of beads and the mere equivalent of $24 in cash. This transaction has long been romanticized as a simple land exchange, a straightforward purchase that marked the beginning of European dominance in the New World. But is this the whole truth? Could such a monumental transfer of land truly be reduced to such a modest exchange? The story beckons us to peel back the layers of time and myth to uncover the reality behind this legendary deal. As we delve deeper, we discover that the sale of Manhattan is shrouded in mystery and ambiguity. Contemporary accounts are scarce, and the few that exist offer conflicting narratives. Some historians argue that the deal was never a formal transaction at all, but rather a series of interactions marked by misunderstanding and differing cultural perceptions of land ownership. Indigenous peoples had a concept of land stewardship and communal ownership, which starkly contrasted with the European notion of absolute ownership and property rights. Moreover, the economic and political motivations behind the Dutch acquisition of Manhattan were far more complex than a simple trade for beads and cash. Strategic interests, such as controlling key trade routes and establishing a foothold in the lucrative fur trade, played significant roles in the decision to claim the island. The symbolic value of Manhattan as a gateway to the New World cannot be understated, adding layers of ambition and foresight to the transaction. As we piece together historical fragments, it becomes clear that the true story of Manhattan's transfer is far more intricate and enigmatic than the popular legend suggests. The transaction remains a historic mystery, inviting ongoing debate and reinterpretation. It challenges us to reconsider the narratives we accept and to seek a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped the early interactions between European settlers and indigenous populations. In unraveling the true tale behind Manhattan's handover, we gain not only a clearer picture of New York's origins but also a more nuanced appreciation of the complexities inherent in historical events. This exploration reminds us that history is seldom as straightforward as it appears and that the truths we uncover often lie beneath layers of myth and misconception. Manhattan's native residents. By the time European colonists arrived in the Hudson River region, the land had already been inhabited for centuries by the Lenape people. They referred to the lush, hilly island along the river as Mannahatta, a name that captures the beauty and geography of the place, Hilly Island. The Lenape, who communicated in an Algonquian language, were skilled traders and engaged in commerce with various indigenous groups, forming a network that spanned much of the Northeast. Living a seasonal existence, the Lenape relied on the island's rich natural resources, which provided them with sustenance and a means of livelihood. The waters teemed with fish, while the forests were home to abundant wildlife, including deer and small game. This harmonious relationship with the land allowed them to thrive, cultivating a deep understanding of their environment and utilizing its offerings sustainably. The Lenape's culture was intricately tied to the rhythms of nature, marked by seasonal migrations and communal gatherings. They celebrated the changing seasons with festivals, honoring the spirits of the land and ensuring that their traditions were passed down through generations. Their societal structures were based on kinship and cooperation, with decisions made collectively to ensure the welfare of the community. As European colonists began to explore and settle in this vibrant region, the Lenape were met with both curiosity and conflict. The arrival of the Dutch and later the English would dramatically alter the course of life for the Lenape, introducing new trade goods and ideas while simultaneously bringing challenges that would threaten their way of life. Understanding the history of the Lenape and their connection to Mannahatta is crucial to grasping the complex dynamics of the early encounters between indigenous Americans and European settlers. This foundation of knowledge not only enriches our perspective on the past but also highlights the resilience and adaptability of the Lenape people in the face of significant change. As we reflect on this history, we are reminded that the stories of indigenous peoples are integral to the narrative of New York and deserve recognition and respect in the broader tapestry of American history. The rich wildlife of the region, particularly its abundant beaver population, captivated the first Europeans who encountered the Lenape and the lush island of Manhattan beginning in the 1500s. These early encounters marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of North America, driven largely by the Europeans' insatiable demand for animal pelts. During this period, beaver fur held a special place in European markets due to its exceptional quality and versatility. It became a crucial element in the production of fashionable hats and luxury items, elevating the beaver hat to a status symbol among the elite. As the demand for these coveted hats skyrocketed, it ignited a fervent wave of exploration and trade that would alter the course of history. With the depletion of fur-bearing animals in Europe, many pushed to the brink of extinction due to relentless hunting, European powers sought new frontiers to satisfy their appetite for fur. They turned their gaze across the Atlantic to North America, a region teeming with wildlife and untouched natural resources. The land offered an abundant supply of beavers, along with other fur-bearing animals, making it an irresistible destination for enterprising explorers and traders. This newfound interest in North America not only fueled the ambitions of European settlers but also transformed the landscape of indigenous trade. The fur trade established a complex web of relationships between European settlers and indigenous nations, as both parties sought to benefit from this lucrative market. Indigenous peoples became essential partners in this trade, utilizing their extensive knowledge of the land and its resources to assist Europeans in trapping and processing furs. However, the pursuit of beaver pelts also had profound consequences. As demand surged, the ecological balance began to shift. Overhunting led to significant declines in beaver populations, disrupting ecosystems and threatening the livelihoods of indigenous communities that relied on these animals for sustenance and cultural practices. Moreover, the introduction of European goods into indigenous societies altered traditional ways of life, sometimes resulting in dependency on trade and undermining indigenous self-sufficiency. As European powers established trade routes and fortified settlements, the beaver trade became a catalyst for broader economic and geopolitical dynamics in North America. The quest for fur not only fueled competition among European nations but also sowed the seeds of conflict between indigenous groups, as alliances shifted and rivalries emerged over control of lucrative trading territories. In retrospect, the beaver fur trade exemplifies the complex interplay of commerce, ecology, and cultural exchange during a transformative era in North American history. It serves as a reminder of how a single commodity can shape societies and impact relationships, revealing the far-reaching consequences of exploration and colonization. As we examine this chapter of history, it is crucial to acknowledge the resilience of indigenous communities who navigated these turbulent changes, highlighting their enduring connection to the land and its resources amid the waves of transformation brought by European contact. The allure of fur trading significantly transformed the economic landscape of the region, creating a dynamic interplay between European settlers and indigenous peoples. As the promise of profit lured European explorers and traders, they began to forge alliances with indigenous nations, including the Lenape. These partnerships were often grounded in mutual benefit, as the Lenape gained access to a variety of European goods, metal tools, firearms, textiles, and other innovations that enhanced their daily lives and survival. For the Lenape, engaging in trade opened doors to new possibilities, allowing them to acquire items that were previously unavailable. The introduction of metal tools, for instance, improved their hunting and agricultural practices, making their work more efficient. Firearms offered new means of protection and hunting, fundamentally altering their interactions with the land and other communities. In return for these valuable goods, the Lenape provided the Europeans with furs, particularly beaver pelts, which were in high demand back in Europe. However, while these alliances were initially beneficial, they also laid the groundwork for complicated and sometimes exploitative relationships. The dynamics of trade often shifted as European demand for furs grew insatiable, leading to increased pressure on indigenous communities to provide more pelts. This demand created a reliance on fur trading that could undermine traditional practices and values. Moreover, the influx of European goods changed indigenous lifestyles in profound ways. The introduction of new technologies and materials not only altered how the Lenape and other tribes interacted with their environment but also influenced their social structures and cultural practices. As the reliance on European trade goods grew, so did the challenges of maintaining their cultural identities and ways of life in the face of rapid change. In addition, the economic power dynamics began to shift. European settlers, motivated by profit, often exploited the Lenape's needs and vulnerabilities. The balance of power in these relationships was not always equal. Colonizers used their superior technology and resources to exert control over trade agreements, leading to terms that often favored European interests. Instances of deception, unfair bargaining, and outright coercion were not uncommon, creating a legacy of mistrust and resentment. As the fur trade expanded, so did the consequences for indigenous peoples. The intensification of hunting led to significant declines in animal populations, disrupting ecosystems and jeopardizing the very resources upon which indigenous communities depended. Additionally, the influx of European settlers and their increasing demands on the land set the stage for territorial disputes and conflicts that would escalate in the years to come. In summary, while the fur trade initially brought about opportunities for collaboration and mutual benefit between European settlers and indigenous peoples, it ultimately led to complex and often exploitative relationships. This chapter of history underscores the intricate balance between commerce, culture, and power, highlighting the need to recognize and understand the lasting impacts of these early interactions on indigenous communities and their legacies. As trade intensified, the Lenape and other indigenous groups found themselves navigating a rapidly changing world, caught in the crosscurrents of economic ambition and cultural transformation. The introduction of European goods certainly brought new opportunities for these communities, enhancing their daily lives and providing tools that could aid in hunting and agriculture. However, this influx of foreign products also led to significant disruptions in traditional lifestyles and ecological balances. The allure of European trade created a demand for pelts that spurred overhunting, with indigenous hunters often feeling pressured to meet the escalating expectations of their European partners. This insatiable quest for fur led to the depletion of animal populations, including beavers, deer, and other vital species. As the numbers of these animals dwindled, the consequences became increasingly severe for indigenous peoples who had relied on them for sustenance, clothing, and cultural practices for generations. The disruption to ecosystems extended beyond the mere absence of animals. It also affected the intricate relationships between species and their habitats. The loss of beaver populations, for example, had cascading effects on wetland ecosystems. Beavers play a crucial role in maintaining these environments through their dam building activities, which create wetlands that support diverse plant and animal life. As their numbers fell, the health of these ecosystems deteriorated, threatening the broader environmental balance that indigenous communities had long respected and nurtured. Moreover, the introduction of European trade goods often shifted indigenous priorities and practices. Traditional hunting and gathering methods became intertwined with the demands of the fur trade, sometimes prioritizing short-term economic gain over sustainable practices. This shift not only altered the ecological landscape but also impacted social structures within indigenous communities. As some members became more focused on trade, the communal values that had guided their societies for generations began to erode. Additionally, the increasing reliance on European goods introduced new vulnerabilities. The very resources that had once ensured the survival of indigenous peoples now became precarious as ecological changes took hold. As animal populations declined and traditional practices faltered, many communities found themselves grappling with food insecurity and a loss of cultural identity. The trade that had initially seemed beneficial began to reveal its darker implications, leading to complex challenges that would resonate through generations. In this rapidly changing landscape, the Lenape and other indigenous groups faced not only ecological upheaval but also the daunting task of preserving their cultural heritage in the face of relentless transformation. Their resilience in adapting to these challenges is a testament to their enduring connection to the land and their commitment to navigating a world increasingly dominated by external influences. As we reflect on this period of history, it becomes clear that the consequences of intensified trade extended far beyond mere economic transactions. The legacy of these interactions serves as a reminder of the intricate balance between cultural practices and ecological sustainability, urging us to recognize the profound impacts of colonial encounters on indigenous peoples and their environments. Moreover, the quest for pelts often led to increased competition and conflict, not only between European settlers and indigenous nations but also among indigenous groups themselves. The dynamics of trade and power shifted, as European settlers established stronger footholds in the region, leading to the eventual displacement of many indigenous peoples. The narrative surrounding beavers and the fur trade in North America encapsulates a microcosm of the broader themes of colonization, economic exploitation, and cultural exchange. This seemingly simple story reveals the intricate web of relationships and consequences that emerged from early European indigenous interactions. At its core, it illustrates how a single commodity, beaver fur, could dramatically shape destinies, transform landscapes, and alter the course of history. As European settlers sought to exploit the natural wealth of the land, the demand for beaver pelts sparked a frenetic trade that not only enriched European economies but also led to profound changes for indigenous communities. The introduction of European goods into indigenous societies created new opportunities for trade and exchange. However, these benefits often came at a steep cost. The pressures of the fur trade compelled indigenous peoples to adapt their traditional ways of life, leading to overhunting and the depletion of vital animal populations. This disruption of ecological balance not only threatened their subsistence but also jeopardized the cultural practices intricately tied to those resources. Moreover, the complexities of these early interactions revealed underlying power dynamics that favored European interests. While the initial partnerships may have seemed mutually beneficial, they often devolved into exploitative relationships where indigenous peoples were marginalized, coerced, or deceived. The fur trade laid the groundwork for ongoing conflicts over land, resources, and cultural sovereignty, resulting in profound and lasting impacts on indigenous communities throughout North America. As we reflect on this historical context, it becomes essential to recognize the enduring consequences of these early encounters. The legacy of fur trading is not merely a chapter in American history, it is intricately woven into the fabric of the nation's identity. The repercussions of these interactions can still be felt today, as indigenous communities continue to navigate the complexities of colonial legacies and strive to reclaim their cultural heritage and rights to the land. Understanding the story of beavers and the fur trade invites us to engage critically with history, acknowledging the complexities and nuances of indigenous experiences. It challenges us to confront the broader implications of economic exploitation and cultural exchange, prompting a deeper examination of how these themes continue to resonate in contemporary society. By honoring the histories of indigenous peoples and recognizing the multifaceted impacts of colonization, we can foster a more inclusive and equitable understanding of our shared past, paving the way for a more just future. Lured by the region's plentiful beaver furs, Dutch merchants began trading with the Lenape and soon claimed land running from what is now Delaware to Rhode Island on behalf of the Dutch West India Company, which developed a monopoly on Atlantic trade. The company established New Netherland in 1621, extending Dutch rule across the Hudson River region. By 1624, Dutch people were living on Manhattan, eventually renamed Manhattan, in a settlement called New Amsterdam. The Dutch West India Company's charter enabled its members to make contracts with princes and natives of the region, trading goods and currency for the people of these fruitful and unsettled parts, places that already served as ancestral lands. And so the corporation set about not just colonizing the land in question, but purchasing as much as possible from its native inhabitants. The murky details of Manhattan's sale. In 1626, the Dutch appeared to have solidified their claim on the island of Manhattan, with colonist Peter Shagen reporting back to the Dutch West India Company that they had purchased the island Manhats from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders. This account suggests a straightforward transaction, implying a clear exchange of value for land. However, the historical reality is far more complex and remains a topic of heated debate. While records indicate that the Dutch did engage in some form of negotiation with the Lenape people regarding the island, the absence of any formal deed or correspondence related to the sale raises critical questions. The lack of documentation has led historians to scrutinize the very nature of the transaction, prompting discussions about what the exchange truly entailed. Did the Lenape understand the concept of land ownership in the same way that the Europeans did? Or was this an agreement based on differing cultural interpretations of land use and stewardship? The amount paid, 60 guilders, has been a point of contention for nearly 400 years. Some argue that this sum reflects a generous deal for the Lenape, while others contend that it grossly undervalues the land's significance to indigenous peoples. The notion that such a substantial and culturally rich territory could be traded for a relatively modest amount of money raises ethical concerns and challenges conventional narratives surrounding land acquisition during the colonial period. Moreover, the implications of this transaction extend beyond mere monetary value. The differing perspectives on land ownership and stewardship highlight the fundamental misunderstandings that characterized early European indigenous interactions. For the Lenape, land was not simply a commodity to be bought and sold. It was an integral part of their identity, culture, and way of life. This profound disconnect underscores the complexities of colonization, where the European quest for territory and resources often disregarded indigenous rights and perspectives. As we reflect on the events of 1626, it becomes clear that the story of the Dutch purchase of Manhattan is emblematic of broader themes in the history of colonization. The enduring disputes over the nature of the transaction remind us of the importance of critically examining historical narratives and acknowledging the voices and perspectives of indigenous peoples. By doing so, we not only gain a more nuanced understanding of the past but also foster a deeper appreciation for the complexities that continue to shape contemporary discussions about land, ownership, and sovereignty. The confusion surrounding the purchase of Manhattan can be traced, in part, to 19th-century legend and interpretation. In the 1840s, historian Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan embarked on a mission to unearth documents from New York's Dutch past, ultimately writing the first scholarly history of the state. His work was pivotal in shaping the narrative of early colonial history, and he later served as state archivist, further solidifying his role as a key figure in this historical discourse. Among O'Callaghan's significant discoveries was the 1626 letter from Peter Shagan, which he cited as evidence of the transaction between the Dutch and the Lenape. In his writings, O'Callaghan characterized the amount paid as a trifling sum, referring to the 60 guilders as a meager exchange for such a splendid tract of land. By equating this payment to approximately $24, O'Callaghan's portrayal reinforced the idea that the Lenape had been shortchanged in a monumental deal that would shape the future of the region. O'Callaghan's interpretations contributed to the emerging legend of the purchase and influenced public perceptions of the event. His framing of the transaction painted the Dutch as shrewd opportunists who exploited the indigenous people's lack of understanding regarding European land ownership concepts. This narrative, while compelling, oversimplified the complexities of the interactions between the Lenape and the Dutch. As O'Callaghan's account gained traction, it entered the popular imagination, leading many to accept the notion that the Lenape had carelessly relinquished their ancestral land for a pittance. This version of events, however, glossed over the nuances of cultural differences and the multiple layers of negotiation that likely characterized the exchange. In retrospect, O'Callaghan's writings illustrate how historical narratives can be shaped by the interpretations of those who document them. His contributions to New York history, while invaluable in many respects, also serve as a reminder of the need to approach historical accounts with a critical lens. The legacy of the Manhattan transaction underscores the importance of recognizing diverse perspectives, particularly those of indigenous peoples whose voices and experiences are often marginalized in mainstream narratives. As we navigate the complexities of this history, it is crucial to acknowledge the lasting impacts of these early encounters and to challenge simplified legends that may obscure the deeper truths of colonization and its consequences. By doing so, we can foster a more inclusive understanding of our shared past, honoring the experiences of all those involved in shaping the history of New York and beyond. Readers latched onto the figure of $24, along with other tales of O'Callaghan's about the exchange of beads for valuable commodities throughout the region, and a legend was born. But it remains unclear whether the exchange involved money, commodities, or both. Modern historians point out that 60 guilders were worth much more than a modern $24 at the time. They were the equivalent of about 1,000 contemporary dollars. And if money did change hands, it likely was accompanied valuable furs, beads, and other trade goods. Similar transactions provide valuable context that supports a more nuanced interpretation of the Dutch indigenous dealings in the region. The final 1670 deed for the Dutch acquisition of Staten Island from the Munsee people illustrates the complexities and dynamics of these negotiations. Unlike the relatively simple narrative of the Manhattan transaction, the Staten Island deal showcases evidence of fierce bargaining and a more substantial exchange of goods. In this instance, the Dutch engaged in a complex negotiation with the Munsee people, ultimately agreeing to a substantial exchange that included over 100,000 wampum beads, an important currency and cultural symbol within indigenous societies. Wampum beads were not merely a form of trade, they carried deep significance, often used in ceremonies and to convey messages of peace and alliance. The inclusion of such a vast quantity of wampum in the transaction underscores the Munsees' assertion of their value and agency in the negotiation process. Alongside the wampum, the Dutch offered significant amounts of clothing, tools, weapons, and ammunition. This multifaceted exchange highlights the intricate relationships and power dynamics at play, illustrating that land transactions during this period were far from straightforward. They were deeply embedded in the social and cultural frameworks of both parties, reflecting a complex understanding of value that went beyond mere economic considerations. The promise made by the Dutch to acknowledge the deed annually as an act of mutual friendship further emphasizes the cultural significance of the agreement. This commitment was not simply a legal formality, it indicated a recognition of the ongoing relationship between the Dutch and the Munsee, one that was meant to honor shared interests and maintain peace. Such expectations of respect and ongoing relations reveal a more nuanced view of colonial interactions, one that acknowledges the importance of diplomacy and mutual acknowledgement in indigenous European relations. This transaction serves as a powerful reminder that land deals were not just about the transfer of territory but were also intertwined with cultural practices, community relations, and social contracts. The complexities of these negotiations challenge the prevailing narratives that often depict indigenous peoples as passive victims of colonial expansion. Instead, they illustrate the active roles that indigenous communities played in shaping their destinies and asserting their rights. In examining such historical transactions, we gain a clearer understanding of the intricate web of relationships that characterized early encounters between indigenous peoples and European settlers. This broader perspective invites us to appreciate the significance of cultural symbols like wampum and the importance of diplomacy in these interactions, ultimately enriching our understanding of the complex history that continues to influence indigenous rights and relations today. This more elaborate negotiation process contrasts sharply with the simplified accounts of the Manhattan transaction. It suggests that indigenous groups were not merely passive participants in these exchanges, rather, they actively engaged in complex negotiations to protect their interests and assert their rights. The Munsees' demands and the wealth of goods exchanged reflect a strong understanding of value and an awareness of the implications of land transactions. Such examples emphasize that while the fur trade and land acquisitions were deeply rooted in economic interests, they also involved significant cultural and social dimensions. Indigenous peoples were not only negotiating for material goods but also for the recognition of their rights and sovereignty. The nature of these transactions indicates that land deals were often steeped in cultural protocols and expectations of ongoing relationships, challenging the notion that European settlers operated solely from a position of power and dominance. By examining transactions like the Staten Island Deed, we gain insight into the intricate and often contentious nature of European indigenous relations. These examples remind us that the history of colonization is not a one-dimensional tale of exploitation but rather a complex interplay of negotiation, resistance, and adaptation. Acknowledging these dynamics allows for a more comprehensive understanding of the past, honoring the agency of indigenous peoples and their enduring legacies in the face of colonial pressures. But no such deed exists for Manhattan. And regardless of whether money, goods, or both changed hands in the transaction, writes historian Paul Otto, the exchange was likely seen as a significant affair by the Lenape. Was Manhattan really sold? That significant affair, involving the Dutch and the Lenape, was not necessarily a straightforward sale, as it is often portrayed. Scholar Otto points out that the Lenape and other Native Americans likely did not comprehend European concepts of property ownership, particularly the idea of individual land rights. Instead, the indigenous inhabitants of the region probably believed they were entering into an agreement to share the land with the Dutch or to rent it to them, reflecting their own cultural understanding of land use and stewardship. This misconception underscores the profound differences in worldview between the two parties. While Europeans viewed land as a commodity to be bought and sold, indigenous peoples generally regarded it as a communal resource, intricately tied to their identity and way of life. This divergence in understanding highlights the complexities and misunderstandings that often characterized early European indigenous interactions. Historian Gene Soderlund emphasizes that, despite the Lenape's reputation as a peaceful nation, they were neither faint-hearted nor weak. Their actions in negotiating with the Dutch reflected a commitment to their sovereignty and a keen desire to protect their trade rights. The Lenape were astute negotiators who understood the importance of maintaining their agency in the face of encroaching European influence. Their willingness to engage in trade and negotiate terms demonstrates not only their adaptability but also their strategic thinking regarding their position in an evolving landscape. The narrative surrounding the Lenape and their interactions with the Dutch serves as a powerful reminder that indigenous communities were not passive victims in the story of colonization. Instead, they actively engaged in complex negotiations, striving to assert their rights and maintain their cultural integrity. By recognizing their agency and understanding the nuances of their negotiations, we can better appreciate the resilience and strength of indigenous peoples in the face of colonial pressures. As we reflect on this historical context, it is essential to acknowledge the lasting impacts of these early encounters on contemporary discussions surrounding land rights, sovereignty, and indigenous self-determination. The story of the Lenape's interactions with the Dutch invites us to reconsider how we interpret historical transactions and to honor the voices and perspectives of indigenous communities, ensuring that their legacies are recognized and respected in the ongoing narrative of American history. The Dutch, on the other hand, operated under the belief that they had successfully purchased the land, which led to their enthusiastic settlement of the area. With the assistance of their colonists, enslaved Africans, merchants from various nations, and individuals fleeing religious persecution, the Dutch began to establish a vibrant community. The beaver trade thrived, to the extent that beaver pelts became an accepted currency throughout New Netherland, underscoring the economic significance of this resource and shaping the colony's growth. By 1664, New Amsterdam had blossomed into a bustling settlement with a population of approximately 1,500 people. This diverse community was remarkable not only for its size but also for its linguistic richness, with a reported 18 languages spoken among the inhabitants. Such diversity reflected the colony's role as a melting pot of cultures, where various peoples came together, each contributing to the unique fabric of life in New Amsterdam. The town was characterized by its fortifications, most notably the wall that encircled it. Built by enslaved laborers, this wall served as a protective barrier against potential threats but also marked the boundaries of the growing settlement. Over time, the remnants of this wall would evolve into what is now known as New York's famed Wall Street, a testament to the complex history of the area and the profound transformations it underwent. As the settlement expanded, the Dutch established trade networks that extended far beyond their immediate borders, integrating New Amsterdam into a global economy. The beaver trade not only enriched the colony but also solidified its importance as a key player in transatlantic commerce. However, this growth came at a cost, as the reliance on enslaved labor and the exploitation of indigenous lands and resources became integral to the colony's success. The story of New Amsterdam serves as a microcosm of the broader themes of colonization, economic ambition, and cultural exchange. It highlights the complexities of early European settlements, where diverse groups intersected and interacted, often leading to both collaboration and conflict. As we reflect on this period of history, it is crucial to recognize the diverse narratives that shaped the colony and to consider the enduring legacies of these interactions on contemporary society. By doing so, we honor the multifaceted history of New York and the people, both indigenous and European, who contributed to its development. Another historic trade, but the wall wasn't enough to protect the Dutch from their own forced takeover. In August 1664, British soldiers stormed New Amsterdam, after its Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, surrendered the multicultural colony a month later. It was renamed New York. Meanwhile, as the Dutch and English were vying for power on the global stage during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, significant military actions unfolded. In 1667, the Dutch launched an invasion of the English colony of Suriname in South America, further escalating tensions between the two nations. This conflict was not merely localized, it was part of a broader struggle for colonial dominance that extended across various regions of the world. That same year, the warring nations reached a pivotal agreement through the Treaty of Breda, which officially exchanged New Netherland, now known as New York, for a range of colonial holdings. This treaty marked a significant turning point, as it recognized the geopolitical realities of the time and underscored the strategic importance of colonial possessions. In the exchange, the Dutch relinquished their claims to New Netherland while gaining control over Suriname and the small yet valuable nutmeg-producing island of Pulau Rune in Indonesia. The treaty exemplified the shifting alliances and mercantile ambitions that characterized the age of colonization. While the loss of New Netherland marked the end of Dutch aspirations in North America, it simultaneously elevated English influence in the region, paving the way for the establishment of New York as a significant English colony. This transition reflected the larger patterns of competition among European powers, where colonial possessions were often traded like commodities in a high-stakes game of diplomacy and warfare. The exchange of New Netherland for distant territories like Suriname and Pulau Rune highlights the complexities of colonial ambitions, where the value of land was not solely determined by its geographical significance but also by its economic potential. The Dutch sought to secure lucrative resources and trade routes, while the English aimed to expand their colonial reach and assert their dominance in the New World. As we consider the implications of the Treaty of Breda, it becomes evident that the history of colonial encounters is intricately woven into the fabric of global relations. The shifting control of territories reveals the interconnectedness of colonial powers and the far-reaching impacts of their conflicts. Understanding this context invites us to reflect on the lasting legacies of these exchanges and the ongoing ramifications for indigenous communities, as well as for the future trajectory of colonial settlements. Meanwhile, the people who considered Manhattan their ancestral land were pushed out. Wars, treaties, and forced removal followed, and by the 1860s most of the Lenape people had been pushed into what is now Oklahoma. Today, 3 Lenape tribes are federally recognized by the U.S., and other Lenape people are still fighting for recognition.